It's a frequent and unfortunate story in the United States that hip-hop artists, often very young, end up getting killed by gun violence. What is it in the music that leads to this? Is there something in the culture? And what's the impact of this when it's applied to broader society? To learn more about this, we speak with Adrian Norman. He's an author, news writer, and political commentator. He's also a member of the Black Leadership Network Project 21, an initiative of the National Center for Public Policy Research that seeks to promote the views of African Americans whose entrepreneurial spirit, dedicated to family, and commitment to individual responsibility have not traditionally been echoed by the nation's civil rights establishment. Adrian shares his take on the violence stemming from the hip-hop music industry that is the topic of his new documentary, Smoke and Mirrors. Adrian has attempted to shed light on an issue that unfortunately only becomes mainstream newsworthy after the killing of aspiring rappers. We speak with Adrian about some of the main narratives on African American communities in the United States, the impacts of progressive policies, and how the nation can move forward. Hey, Adrian Norman, thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me, Josh. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and always a pleasure. So, you put together a pretty interesting documentary. It's called Smoke and Mirrors. And, you're raising one of the bigger issues that people look at when they talk about Black Lives Matter, which is violence in Black communities. And I think your documentary is really interesting because you touch on things I've never heard anybody touch on. And I guess just introducing this, can you tell us kind of why you wanted to do this documentary? Why focus on black crime, and especially focusing on among the rap community in particular?
Sure, absolutely. So, and I'm glad to hear you say that we're touching on some things that you haven't really heard discussed before. The impetus for this project was the death of Takeoff a few months ago. He was a rapper in the group Migos. And it was just the latest in a string of killings of hip-hop artists over the years. So after that death, lots of questions were raised, and of course, lots of conversations began about, once again, violence within Black communities, violence within hip hop, and people sort of exploring ways to figure out how to address those issues. A lot of times we get into this in the video, these conversations happen, and then a few months later, things kind of go by and we forget about those conversations and everybody just kind of moves on, and it just keeps happening over and over again. So this project was designed to sort of keep a spotlight on it and try to shine a light on this issue and try to assess why this keeps happening and what is going on in these communities to where this is a regular occurrence, because this doesn't seem to happen to artists in any other genre. This isn't happening to house music producers. This isn't happening to rock stars. This seems to be an exclusively, by and large, Black music phenomenon. So I will push back a little bit initially and say it's not a project about Black on Black crime. Black on Black crime really isn't a thing. People victimize who they're closest to. Blacks victimize Blacks at the exact same rate that whites victimize whites. So if we're going to say Black on Black crime, we need to have a conversation about white on white crime. Overall crime is just crime. You victimize who's closest to you. But I put together a panel of people who, frankly, are a lot smarter than me. And we took a look at this and conducted a series. Well, I had an interview with each of them that ran a very long time. So we got into a couple of overlapping themes in addressing this issue. We focused on families. We had conversations about political choices and progressive policies that have impacted these communities and brought them to the destabilized positions that they're in. We get into how neighborhoods have been destroyed, the actual music, and is it art imitating life or life imitating art? And then we also got into some solutions on how to actually resolve this issue. So I think it's a productive piece. It runs about 80 minutes. I hope people tune in because, again, it's bringing together people who don't necessarily agree on every single point, just like in real life. But there are a lot of stakeholders on this issue. We're all impacted in some way when there's violence in any community, whether we want to admit it or not. So it's a pretty broad conversation that we have. We cover a lot of areas, and I think if you make it to the end, you're gonna see ways that individuals can start to make a difference in their own community, and we can start to tackle this issue and end some of this violence that's plaguing communities throughout the United States.
Yeah, speaking of the race issue, there's something really important that you brought up in this documentary, kind of more towards the beginning, which is that it kind of raises the question of, are we having the right conversations? We tend to view this as a Black issue. and not as an American. Well, I think more towards the middle you got to this, but we're not viewing this as an American issue. And this really brought up some of the questions, some of the discussions I see people having, especially among conservatives, where you have a lot of these anti-white narratives, white America, white people responsible for this and that. But it goes both ways, a lot of different ways, actually, where people tend to view problems in the black community as problems with the black community, and they don't view it as an American problem. Why did you choose to bring up that discussion? Because I actually really agree with you on that. We need to start viewing things not as one group or another, but as problems for us as a nation.
Yeah, that came up in the conversation on family structures in the nuclear family. Conservatives a lot of times like to focus on fatherless homes, and we often use this trope. 70% of black kids are fatherless, which is factually untrue. I mean, data's been out on that since 2013. The CDC releases information on it, which we get into in the video. But Rachel was making that point and saying that when it comes to the issue of fatherlessness, that number is closer to 50%. But it's not that it's just an exclusively black phenomenon. It also impacts Hispanics. It also impacts whites. It's just that blacks get hit first, and then everybody else gets hit later. So it's very limiting and reductive and unproductive to have a conversation that's focused on such a statistical falsehood and making it seem like it's just a black problem when really it is an American problem. And I think that, again, with this conversation, we can kind of open up dialogue a little bit more and have sort of a broader conversation on all of these things. But yeah, we have to start viewing these issues as not exclusive to just one community, and realize that all of these problems impact the entire country. If there's part of your city that is violent or experiences violence, if someone loses a life, that's one more creator we don't have. That's one more potential scientist that we don't have. That's a potential astronaut or doctor that we don't have participating in society to help move us forward and to solve challenges and to make the world a better place. So ultimately, all of this is everyone's problem. And again, one of the goals of this project was to try to have a more productive conversation and iron out and hash out the facts about how we got here in the first place and also the solutions. Those two things aren't separate. We can't talk about where to go if we don't know where we've been. So we get into some of the history of what's happened to these communities with policies that have destroyed them, things that have led us to the point that we have some of the disparities that we have, and then also ways that we can move forward.
Yeah, and you also, actually towards the beginning, I think you do mention this part, which is, like 80% of black America, this does not really apply to. And we tend to group, look, the left does it a lot, the right does it too. We tend to group people too much, at least in my opinion. And, look, the problems we're seeing in inner cities and, poorer communities, whether it's, the bad parts of East New York or whether it's like Appalachia, white areas, you do see these kind of same problems. But that does not, when it comes to black Americans, this does not represent the overwhelming majority of them. You mentioned, I think, 80% of black America is like middle class.
Yeah, 80% of black America.
And so for some reason, we tend to view everybody as being part of that.
Yeah.
And But yeah, it kind of address why you brought that up, because that's an interesting discussion point I haven't really heard anybody talk about.
Yeah, well, the problems that we say are black phenomenon are also problems that you see in white Appalachians. It's more of an issue of economics versus race, and I think it's very limiting to make every discussion about race when there are stronger conversations that we could be having. So yeah, the problems that are plaguing black inner cities are also plaguing poor white areas. A poor white person has more in common with a poor black person than do a rich white person. So the focus on race is a little idiotic at this point in time. But there are some things and some problems that are exclusive to the black community, because we have a history of the state imposing laws and restrictions specifically against us with the intent of disenfranchising black people and bringing about those disparities in the first place. We get into that history in the video. Last year, something came up, I think, with Pete Buttigieg was talking about the highways were racist or something like that. And it was a big trope on the right. People made a lot of jokes about it. But if you want,
I always suspected, man, those dang highways.
If you understand history, though, you understand that's a real phenomenon. Not just that highways are inherently racist, right? But when you get into the history of how some of these highway systems were designed, you had thriving black neighborhoods, metropolises, and well, metropolis is probably too strong of a word, but thriving black neighborhoods and economic centers and stable neighborhoods and stable families. And they literally built these highway systems right through them to break them up and destroy them. We had areas like Black Wall Street that were big financial centers, and there were more. It wasn't just Black Wall Street. There were numerous across the entire country, and the government, through policy, through intentional action, destroyed those communities. We had projects that were put up for low-income public housing. We had governments that the government that wouldn't allow the Federal Housing Administration to lend to Black people. Not only wouldn't allow the banks to lend to Black people who wanted to buy homes, but they wouldn't lend to white people who wanted to live next to Black people. So you have this cascade of government policy from the East Coast all the way to California that was intentionally designed to negatively impact Black Americans. And that's how these neighborhoods got destabilized in the first place.